Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Kirkbride, and I'm the Instructional Leadership Director for Jackson Madison County Schools. In this presentation, we will take a deeper look at the starter section of our instructional framework. We will provide specific examples for focusing activities, objectives, and the agenda. I hope you enjoy this presentation. As a reminder, our instructional framework is comprised of how we teach on a daily basis, combined with what we teach on a daily basis. Here you can see the instructional framework as a whole. The how, which is comprised of the starter, engagement, and ending, is outlined at the top. Beneath that, we will measure the what we teach on a daily basis with standard alignment, core actions 1, 2, and 3. Here's a screenshot of the how section of our instructional framework. Today, we will take a deeper look at the starter section only. The starter section of our instructional framework can be broken into 3 general categories: greeting, focusing activity, objectives, and agenda. Greeting. Teacher greets students as they enter the room with a smile. Now, we know that in lower elementary grades, this might look different than upper elementary, middle, and high school grades. This is because teachers might already be in the classroom assisting students, whereas in upper elementary grades, middle school grades, and high school grades, teachers are more able to stand at the door and greet students. Why is it important for us to greet students? It helps us build relationships, it communicates expectations as students enter the room, and it helps us identify any problems or difficult situations with individual students before learning begins. Some things to think about as it pertains to the greeting. What is your routine for making sure your students are greeted? What must be done prepared ahead of time so you are freed up to be able to greet your students? And what are some things that could distract you from greeting your students? And when else could those things be handled? Right now would be a great time to pause the video and have a table discussion about these 3 questions. Now let's take a look at the focusing activity. Learning begins when students enter the room. A focusing activity should be posted or ready for students before they enter. We have determined a 3 to 5 rule of thumb. This means that, in general, 3 to 5 questions of increasing complexity answered or 3 to 5 sentences written in response to a text should be posted for students to begin on as they enter. The focusing activity is related to a previous or current lesson. All students are seated and begin work without direction from the teacher. And the focusing activity is reviewed or discussed once completed. Now, it's important to note here that the 3 to 5 rule of thumb is just a suggestion. So that doesn't mean if you have 2 questions of increasing complexity that you're necessarily wrong, or if you have 6 questions of increasing complexity that you are wrong. The 3 to 5 rule is simply a starting point. Now let's look at why it's important to have a focusing activity. A focusing activity can help maximize the use of instructional time. It is impossible to have bell-to-bell instruction if learning doesn't begin as soon as students enter the classroom. It communicates a sense of urgency to our students. It helps students transition from a hallway state of mind to a learning state of mind where they know that learning begins as soon as they enter the classroom. A focusing activity reduces variables in a student's day. Students know what is expected of them from class to class. And it can help reduce classroom management issues and enhance relationships by reducing non-positive interactions between teachers and students. When students know that a focusing activity is to begin as soon as they enter the classroom, teachers can cut down on the number of nagging comments they have to get them started as they enter the classroom. If you have questions for students to answer instead of a writing prompt, it's important that the questions show a progression of complexity. Some examples of resources you can use as you plan out these questions are Webb's depth of knowledge charts, Costa's levels of questions, and Bloom's taxonomy. Now, it's important to remember that the 3 to 5 questions is just a rule of thumb. As stated earlier, you might have 2 questions of increasing complexity, or you might have 6 questions of increasing complexity. Here you see examples of authors' Costa's levels of questions and depth of knowledge levels. Now, it's important for us to talk about focusing activities in early grades. Although focusing activities are intended to be as independent as possible for students, teachers of early grade students will have to make determinations on what will work best for their classes. For example, questions from the focusing activity might be stated orally by the teacher as students learn to read. Or students might be asked to think about the questions and then share with a partner or the teacher as the students learn to write. Remember, no pressure to do this perfectly as we get started. It's simply important that we begin this process. It's also important for us to make a determination between the difference of morning work and focusing activities in early grades. Focusing activities are designed to directly precede instruction on that subject. Focusing activities should activate thinking for students. Morning work can be spiral review, handwriting practice, or other isolated tasks that are independent from the main content of the day's lesson. For example, if a student comes to school and goes directly from a classroom to an intervention or an activity period, then they might complete morning work during or immediately after breakfast. In this scenario, students wouldn't complete a focusing activity until the time that immediately precedes the scheduled time for that subject. For example, from 8:15 to 8:30 is breakfast and morning work. Then students transition at 8:30 to 9:10 for activity period. When students return from activity period at 9:10, they begin their ELA block. During this time is when the focusing activity for English language arts should take place. Now, here are some examples of morning work and focusing activities in early grades. On the left, you see a sample morning work for kindergarten where students write their first and last name. On the right, you see a sample focusing activity in kindergarten directly pulled from a CKLA module. Here are some examples of a focusing activity for first grade English language arts. This example comes from the CKLA Listening Learning Strand, Domain 9, Lesson 4. The anchor text is the frog prints. The vocabulary word from the anchor text is retrieved. Below, you see the text in which the word was used during a read aloud. For this focusing activity, students simply write the word, draw a picture of the word, and then use the word in a sentence. Here's an example of a fourth grade social studies focusing activity. Students read an article about Valley Forge during the Revolutionary War. and you see 3 questions, not overly detailed or time-consuming, based on the current day's objective. The questions are text-based, and you can see that the questions increase in complexity from 1 to 3. For example, question 1 is explicit and can be found in the text. Question 2 requires comprehension of the text and at least one explicit example from the text. And you can see that question 3 requires students to analyze to find more information to support their conclusion. Here's an example of a 6th grade ELA focusing activity. This focusing activity was based on the previous day's reading of Chapter 2 in Hatchet. It requires students to refer to their book to answer the questions. Notice, this focusing activity has 4 questions. They're not overly detailed or time-consuming. They are based on the previous day's learning. The questions are text-based, and the questions do increase in complexity from 1 to 4. If you notice, question 1 could be explicitly found in the text with some summarizing required. Questions 2 and 3 require comprehension of the text and citation of evidence. Question 4 requires recognition and understanding of figurative language used, along with analyzing the impact of figurative language on the tone of the passage. Here you see an example of a 9th grade ELA focusing activity. Again, this was based on the previous day's reading of Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. It requires students to refer to their book and to use evidence to support their answers. Again, notice there are 4 questions. They're not overly detailed. They're based on the previous day's reading. The questions are text-based, and they do increase in complexity from 1 to 4. Here's an example of a focusing activity for middle school art. Notice the standard says to demonstrate an understanding of the elements of art and the principles of design. This focusing activity is based on an article titled The 7 Principles of Art and Design. You can see an excerpt from the article on the left. Notice the questions increase in complexity from 1 to 3. Here's an example of a focusing activity for high school anatomy and physiology. It's based on yesterday's text. It requires the students to respond to the questions in 3 to 5 sentences. Now let's take a look at the objectives and agenda for our starter section of the instructional framework. Current learning objectives and agendas for the class are posted and communicated. The learning objectives are based on the standards being taught. It is important to note here that one standard might have multiple objectives for the class. Why is it important to have objectives and agenda posted? They define the major chunks of your lesson. Students are able to identify the what of the lesson. Students know where the class is headed and perceive a structured environment with expectations, and we also know that structure fosters a sense of safety and security. Here you see an example of objectives and an agenda. This sample is based off of Module 1, Unit 2, Lesson 3 in Expeditionary Learning. You can see that there are 2 main objectives pertaining to the standard for the day, and that the agenda is not overly detailed. Notice in the agenda that revisiting Papa's death, evaluating and discussing challenges to human rights, and writing about how characters respond to challenges would define the major chunks of the lesson and make up the majority of the time spent in the lesson. Now would be a good time to pause the video and discuss the importance of having objectives and your agenda posted for the class. Now let's talk about what feedback would look like as it pertains to the instructional framework. Before doing so, let's talk about why it's important that we receive feedback. First, it's important to remember that it's all about coaching. And the more coaching conversations we have about instruction, the more instruction will improve. As leaders in the district, we owe you feedback to help you grow as a professional. And finally, our students deserve to attend schools where professionals are reflective about their own practices and open to feedback. This includes teachers, principals, support staff, everyone across the district. So how would feedback be determined if a walkthrough happened during a focusing activity? Since it's during the starter, that is the section of the lesson that would be looked at first. Then the IPG indicators would be looked at to determine the quality of the focusing activity. Here we will use this 6th grade ELA example. Notice that it's based on the previous day's reading of Chapter 2 in Hatchet, and it refers students to their book to answer the following questions. So we would look at the starter section and ask ourselves, does what I see or hear mostly align with this or not? And we would ask, were there any missed opportunities? Following that, we would inspect the quality of the focusing activity with the IPG indicators outlined in the What section of the instructional framework. We would ask ourselves if the lesson reflects on the demands of the standards. In this case, yes. Next, we would look at Core Action 1 and ask ourselves, is the majority of the lesson spent reading, writing, and speaking about text? In this case, yes. Next, in Core Action 1, we would ask ourselves if the texts are at or above the quantitative and quantitative complexity level expected for the grade level at this time in the school year. In this case, the answer would be yes. Next, we would look at Core Action 2. Do most questions and writing tasks return students to the text to build understanding? The answer in this case is yes. Are most questions and writing tasks requiring students to collect and use evidence from the text to demonstrate an understanding and to support their ideas about the text? In this case, yes. Are most questions and writing tasks focusing students on the most important words, phrases, and sentences that matter the most to understanding the text and how they are used in the text? In this case, yes. Are most questions intentionally sequenced to support knowledge by guiding students to delve deeper into the text? Yes. Now we will look at Core Action 3. Core Action 3 wants to know if the task at hand provides all students with opportunities to engage in the work of the lesson. More specifically, in Core Action 3A, the teacher provides opportunities for students to productively struggle and persevere with the task that meets the demands of the standard. Core Action 3B wants to know, does the teacher expect evidence and precision from the students, and does the teacher probe students' answers accordingly? Do the students display persistence in providing textual evidence to the answers and responses, orally and or in writing? In this case, it's going to be dependent on the teacher's actions in the room. Did the strategies such as praise, prompt, and leave occur? It's important to note that as we walk through the IPG indicators, when we get to a question where we circle no, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't occur. That simply means that we have a question about what we saw and we want to have further discussion. So to recap, the starter is comprised of 3 general sections: the greeting, the focusing activity, and the objectives and agenda for the day.